A woman wrapped in dust and mountain silence stepped through the door of Carter's General Store after 40 years of absence. The bell above the door rang just as it had decades ago, and behind the counter, Daniel Carter's hands froze mid-motion. The ledger he'd been writing in fell with a heavy thud. He knew that face, older now, carved by wind and solitude, but unmistakable. Clara Whitmore. The woman who had vanished without a word when they were both young. The woman he'd searched for until hope turned to ash. She was standing in his store as if time itself had cracked open. Before we begin this story of love lost and found across 4 decades of silence, I invite you to join me on this journey. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Carter's General Store, casting long shadows across flour sacks and bolts of fabric. Daniel Carter had been restocking shelves with the methodical rhythm of a man who'd performed the same tasks for 40 years. At 63, his hands were steady, his back still straight despite the decades of labor. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and loss. He was updating the inventory ledger when the bell above the door chimed. The sound was ordinary, he heard it dozens of times each day, but something made him look up. Perhaps it was the quality of the silence that followed. Perhaps it was the way the light shifted when the door opened. Or perhaps, on some level deeper than conscious thought, he simply knew. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall and lean, her frame suggesting strength rather than fragility. A long canvas coat hung from her shoulders, dust-stained and worn thin at the elbows. Her boots were scuffed and resoled multiple times, the leather cracked from hard use. She carried no bag, no belongings of any kind. Her face was weathered, tanned dark by sun and wind, with deep lines bracketing her mouth and fanning from the corners of her eyes. Her hair, streaked with gray, had been pulled back into a simple braid. But her eyes were the same clear gray they'd always been. The ledger slipped from Daniel's fingers and hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot. "Clara!" Her name left his lips as barely more than a whisper. A ghost of sound that seemed to carry 40 years of questions, anger, grief, and something else he couldn't quite name. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, her weathered hands hanging loose at her sides. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The afternoon light painted her in shades of gold and shadow, and Daniel found himself caught between the woman standing before him and the ghost he'd carried in his memory for 4 decades. "Hello, Daniel." Her voice was lower than he remembered, rougher, shaped by years of disuse and solitude. But the cadence was familiar, falling into rhythms his memory had preserved with painful accuracy. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that were too large, too complex, too laden with history to force into the open air. His hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. Clara took a step forward, then another. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click. She moved with an odd grace, economical and precise, like someone accustomed to navigating rough terrain. When she reached the counter, she stopped, keeping the scarred wooden surface between them. "You're alive," Daniel finally managed, and immediately felt the inadequacy of the words. "I am." 40 years. His voice hardened. 40 years, Clara. "I know." "Do you?" The anger he'd buried for decades suddenly surfaced, hot and sharp. "Do you have any idea—" He stopped, forced himself to breathe. "Where were you?" "The mountains," she said simply. "The high country. Places without names." "Alone?" She nodded. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Daniel studied her face, searching for the young woman he'd known. She'd been 22 when she disappeared, vibrant and restless, with a spirit too large for the small frontier town. Now she was 62, transformed by decades he couldn't imagine. "Why?" The question emerged raw and unguarded. "Why did you leave?" Clara's gray eyes met his, and he saw something flicker in their depths, pain, perhaps, or regret. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "Of what?" "Of staying. Of the life that was waiting for me here." She paused, her gaze never wavering. "Of hurting you more than I already was." Daniel felt the words like a physical blow. "So you disappeared, without a word, without a letter, without giving me a choice." "Yes." The stark honesty of her admission left him momentarily speechless. He'd imagined this conversation countless times over the years, in the first desperate months after she vanished, during the empty years that followed, even after he'd married Sarah and built a new life. In his imagination, Clara had always offered excuses, justifications, elaborate explanations, but this simple, terrible truth cut deeper than any excuse could have. "I searched for you," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "For months. I rode out to your family's old homestead. I asked everyone who might have seen you. I followed every rumor, every possible trail." "I know." "You know?" Anger flared again. "How could you possibly—" "I saw you once," Clara interrupted softly. "That first winter. You were riding through the foothills with two men from town. I was camped about a mile away, up in the rocks where you couldn't see me. I watched you search for 3 days. The revelation struck him like a fist. You were there. You were right there. And you let me— He couldn't finish. The betrayal felt fresh, as raw as if it had happened yesterday, instead of 40 years ago. "I know what I did, Daniel. I've always known." "Then why are you here now? Why come back after all this time?" Clara's hands, which had been resting on the counter, slowly curled into fists. It was the first sign of tension she'd shown since entering the store. "Because I couldn't carry it anymore," she said. "The weight of leaving. The weight of watching you search and doing nothing. The weight of every year that passed." She took a slow breath. "I thought time would make it easier. I thought if I went far enough, stayed away long enough, I could outrun what I'd done. But some things you can't outrun." Daniel wanted to rage at her. He wanted to demand answers to 4 decades of questions. He wanted to throw her words back in her face and tell her she had no right to return, no right to stand in his store and speak of regret as if it could somehow balance the scales. But looking at her, really looking at her, he saw something that stopped the words in his throat. She stood perfectly still, her weathered face composed, but there was a brittleness to her posture, a tension that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. This wasn't the triumphant return of someone seeking absolution. This was someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road and didn't know what came next. "You can't just—" Daniel stopped, started again. 40 years, Clara. I built a whole life in 40 years. "I know. I heard about Sarah." The mention of his late wife's name felt like an intrusion, and Daniel's jaw tightened. "How?" "I came through town once, about 15 years ago. I stayed on the edges where no one would recognize me. I heard people talking about the wedding at the Carter place, your daughter's wedding." Clara's voice remained steady, but something shifted in her eyes. "They said it was beautiful. They said Sarah would have been so proud." Daniel's breath caught. Sarah had been gone for 8 years, taken by fever that even the new doctor from back east couldn't cure. The grief had dulled over time, settling into a quiet ache that he carried with practiced ease. But hearing Clara speak her name brought it all back with unexpected force. "You were here," he said slowly. "You came back, and you didn't—" "I had no right to interrupt your life," Clara said. "Not after what I'd done. I only came to know that you were all right, that you'd found happiness." "Did I?" The question emerged before he could stop it, sharp and bitter. "Did I find happiness, Clara? Or did I find what was possible after you tore my whole world apart?" The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Clara flinched, barely, just a slight tightening around her eyes. But she didn't look away. "That's fair," she said quietly. "Fair?" Daniel felt a harsh laugh building in his chest. "None of this is fair. You don't get to show up after 40 years and talk about fairness." "No," Clara agreed. "I don't." The admission deflated his anger slightly, leaving something more complex in its wake. He studied her face again, noting details he'd missed in the initial shock. There were scars he didn't remember, a thin white line along her jaw, another disappearing into her hairline. Her hands, resting on the counter between them, were calloused and marked with old injuries. This was a woman who had lived hard, who had chosen a life of difficulty over comfort. "Why the mountains?" he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. "Why such complete isolation?" Clara was quiet for a moment, her gray eyes distant. "Because it was the only place I could breathe," she finally said. "This town, this life, It felt like a cage closing in. Every day was the same. Every choice led to the same inevitable future. I would marry you. We'd have children. I'd spend my days cooking and cleaning and slowly disappearing into the role everyone expected me to fill. She paused. I know how that sounds. I know it seems ungrateful, childish even, but I felt like I was suffocating. You could have told me, Daniel said. I would have listened. We could have found another way. Could we? Clara's question was gentle but pointed. Really? In 1845, in a town like this, what other options were there for a woman like me? I couldn't just leave and expect to be accepted back. I couldn't ask you to abandon your family's store, your responsibilities. The only choice I had was to stay and slowly lose myself, or leave completely. So you chose to leave. You chose the mountains over me. Yes. Again, that terrible honesty. Daniel felt something inside him shift, some long-held certainty beginning to crack. I loved you, he said, and was surprised by how steady his voice remained. I would have done anything for you. I know, Clara replied. That's why I had to leave. Because if I'd stayed, if I'd tried to explain, you would have convinced me. You would have found all the right words, made all the right promises, and I would have stayed. And then, 5 years later, or 10, I would have resented you for it. I would have looked at you across the breakfast table and hated you for being part of the cage, even though the cage was my own making. The insight was devastating in its clarity. Daniel wanted to deny it, to insist that love would have been enough, that they could have found a way. But he remembered the restless energy that had always surrounded Clara, the way she'd gaze at the distant mountains with something like hunger in her eyes. He remembered arguments they'd had about the future, how she'd go quiet and withdrawn whenever he talked about building a home, starting a family. So instead, you let me spend 40 years wondering what I'd done wrong, he said. Pain flickered across Clara's weathered face. I never thought... She stopped, corrected herself. No, that's not true. I did think about it. I thought about it every single day, but I told myself it was better than the alternative, better a clean break than a slow poison. Better for who? I thought for both of us. Now I'm not so sure. The admission seemed to cost her something. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since entering the store, she looked away from him, her gaze dropping to the scarred counter between them. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening. The quality of light in the store had changed, shadows lengthening and deepening. In the street beyond the windows, a wagon rattled past. Someone called a greeting to a neighbor. The ordinary sounds of town life continued, indifferent to the extraordinary moment unfolding inside Carter's General Store. Daniel realized his hands were trembling. He pressed them flat against the counter, feeling the familiar grain of wood beneath his palms. This counter had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. His father had built it, and Daniel had spent countless hours here. As a boy learning the business, as a young man courting Clara in stolen moments between customers, as a husband and father supporting his family, as a widower finding purpose in routine. The store was full of memories. Clara was in so many of them. I married Sarah 2 years after you left, he heard himself say. I'd finally accepted that you weren't coming back. She was kind, patient. She knew I was still carrying you with me, and she loved me anyway. He looked up, met Clara's eyes again. We had 36 years together. We built a good life. We had 3 children, Thomas, Mary, and Elizabeth. We weathered hard times and celebrated good ones. When she died, I thought my heart would break all over again. I'm sorry, Clara said softly, for your loss. Are you? Or are you relieved you didn't have to compete with a ghost? The cruelty of the question surprised even Daniel, but he didn't take it back. Clara absorbed it without flinching. Both, probably, she said. I'm sorry you suffered, but yes, knowing you found someone, that you weren't alone, it made the weight a little easier to carry. How considerate of you. Daniel, no. He held up a hand, stopping her. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk back into my life and expect... What? Forgiveness? Understanding? What exactly did you come here for, Clara? The question hung between them, sharp and necessary. Clara stood silent for a long moment, her weathered hands slowly uncurling on the counter. I don't know, she finally admitted. I told myself I came to apologize, to finally say the words I should have said 40 years ago. But standing here now, I realize how inadequate that is, how impossible it is to apologize for something that can't be undone. Then why are you here? Clara's gray eyes met his, and in them he saw something vulnerable and raw. Because I'm tired, Daniel. I'm 62 years old and I'm tired. Tired of running, tired of living like a shadow, tired of carrying the weight of what I did to you, to us. I spent 40 years in the mountains, and they were exactly what I needed. They were freedom and silence and space to be nothing but myself. But somewhere along the way, I realized that freedom isn't the same thing as belonging. And I never stopped belonging. She stopped, her voice catching slightly. I never stopped belonging to the memory of you. The confession seemed to drain something from her. She swayed slightly, and Daniel saw with sudden clarity how exhausted she was. Not just from the journey that had brought her here, but from decades of isolation, of carrying guilt and regret across endless miles of wilderness. When did you last eat? He asked, the question emerging from some instinct deeper than anger or hurt. Clara blinked, seeming surprised by the change of subject. Yesterday morning, some dried meat and cornmeal. Yesterday, Daniel shook his head. Sit down. Daniel, just sit down, Clara. She hesitated, then moved to one of the wooden chairs near the stove. She lowered herself into it with the careful movements of someone whose body had been pushed to its limits. Daniel watched her for a moment, then turned to the small kitchen area at the back of the store. His hands moved automatically, slicing bread, cutting cheese, pouring water from the pitcher into a tin cup. The familiar actions helped steady him, giving his reeling thoughts something concrete to anchor to. When he returned to the front, Clara was sitting very still, her eyes closed, her weathered face turned toward the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. Here, he said, setting the plate and cup on the counter beside her. Clara's eyes opened. She looked at the simple meal, then up at him, and he saw something complicated move across her face. Thank you, she said quietly. She ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned not to waste food or rush through meals. Daniel returned to the counter, ostensibly to continue his inventory work, but found himself watching her instead. The way she held the bread, the careful sips of water, the unconscious straightening of her spine as food brought back some strength, all of it spoke of a life he couldn't begin to imagine. Where have you been living? He asked. All these years? Clara finished chewing before answering. Different places. I followed the seasons, mostly. High meadows in summer, lower valleys in winter. Built shelters where I needed them. Trapped and hunted for food and pelts to trade when supplies ran low. Alone the entire time? Mostly. I'd encounter trappers sometimes, or hunting parties. Indigenous peoples who were kind enough not to question a strange woman living in their territory, but I kept my distance from everyone. 40 years in the wilderness, completely alone. Daniel struggled to comprehend it. How did you survive? A faint smile touched Clara's lips, the first he'd seen since she walked through the door. I learned, made mistakes, and survived them. Nearly died a few times, once from exposure, twice from injuries, once from bad water. But I learned. She took another sip of water. The mountains teach you quickly. Either you adapt or you don't make it. You always were stubborn. Yes, she agreed. That hasn't changed. Another silence fell between them, but this one felt different somehow, less fraught, though no less heavy with history. I saw you through the window, Clara said suddenly. Before I came in. You were working on your ledger and the light was falling across your shoulders the same way it used to when we were young. For a moment, I could almost pretend no time had passed at all. She set down the cup. But then you looked up, and I saw all 40 years in your face. You're not the only one who aged, Clara. No, but you aged among people, with family and friends and the daily rhythm of ordinary life. I aged in silence, with only my own thoughts for company. She paused. Sometimes I wonder which is harder. Daniel found himself without an answer. He studied her face again, the deep lines, the weathered skin, the gray-streaked hair. But beneath the evidence of hard living, he could still see traces of the woman he'd loved, the straight line of her nose, the particular curve of her jaw, the way her eyes caught the light. You mentioned children, Claire said. Thomas, Mary, and Elizabeth. Tell me about them. The request was so unexpected that Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to keep that precious part of his life separate from this complicated reunion. But another part, the part that still remembered loving this woman, wanted her to know. Thomas is 40, he began slowly. He runs the family ranch with his wife, Margaret. They have 5 children of their own. He's steady, reliable, takes after Sarah's side of the family. And Mary? 38. She married a banker from the next town over. They have 3 children. She writes letters every week, visits when she can. Daniel felt a slight smile tug at his lips. She inherited my stubbornness and Sarah's kindness, a formidable combination. And Elizabeth? 35. Still unmarried, which scandalizes half the town and amuses the other half. She helps me run the store, keeps the books better than I ever could. Sharp as a tack and twice as prickly. She sounds like someone I might have been, Clara said quietly, if I'd stayed. The observation sent an unexpected pang through Daniel's chest. He'd never considered the parallel before, but Clara was right. Elizabeth had that same restless energy, that same fierce independence that had always characterized Clara. She asks about you sometimes, he found himself saying. Clara's head came up sharply. What? Elizabeth. She's heard the stories, town gossip being what it is. She knows her father was engaged to a woman who disappeared 40 years ago. She asks questions sometimes, wants to know what you were like. What do you tell her? Daniel considered the question carefully. The truth. That you were brilliant and restless and unlike anyone I'd ever met. That you saw the world differently than everyone else. That you left because staying would have killed something essential in you. Tears suddenly brightened Clara's eyes, though she blinked them back before they could fall. That's more generous than I deserve, she said, her voice rough. Maybe. Or maybe it's just the truth. They sat in silence as the last of the daylight faded from the store. Daniel lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the gathering shadows. The simple domestic act felt strange given the circumstances. He was lighting a lamp for Clara Whitmore, who had been dead to him for 40 years, who had just walked back into his life as casually as if she'd only been gone for an afternoon. Where are you staying? He asked. I haven't thought that far ahead. There's a boarding house on Maple Street. Mrs. Henderson runs it. She's discreet, doesn't ask too many questions. All right. Clara stood, her movements still careful. The food had helped, but exhaustion still showed in every line of her body. Thank you for the meal. Clara, Daniel stopped her as she turned toward the door. Why now? After all these years, why come back now? She turned back to face him, her weathered features composed but her eyes betraying deep emotion. Because I turned 62 last month, and I realized I might not have many more years left. I've spent 40 years running from what I did to you, from the choice I made. I thought I could carry that weight to my grave. She paused, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. But in the end, I couldn't. I needed to see you one more time, to say I'm sorry, to let you tell me all the things I deserve to hear, and maybe— Her voice broke slightly. Maybe to find out if there was anything left that couldn't be completely destroyed by 40 years and one terrible choice. The raw honesty of her words left Daniel momentarily speechless. He stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the worn wood while she stood by the door with the last light of evening painting her in shades of gold and shadow. I don't know what you expect me to say, he finally managed. Nothing. I expect nothing, Daniel. I gave up the right to expectations 4 decades ago. Then what do you want? Clara smiled, sad and small. To sleep in a real bed tonight, to wake up tomorrow and see how it feels to breathe the same air as you again. Beyond that, she shrugged. I truly don't know. She reached for the door handle, then paused. I know this doesn't change anything, she said without turning around. I know sorry is just a word, and words can't unmake the past. But I'm sorry, Daniel, for all of it, for the pain I caused, for the years I stole from you, for the life we might have had. Before he could respond, she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. The bell chimed once, then fell silent. Daniel stood alone in the lamplight, surrounded by the familiar walls of his store, and felt as if the ground beneath his feet had fundamentally shifted. 40 years of certainty, about what had happened, about who Clara Whitmore had been, about the story he told himself, had just been challenged by the simple presence of a weathered woman who had come down from the mountains. He looked down at the plate she'd left on the chair, empty except for a few crumbs. Such a simple thing. He'd fed countless people in this store over the decades, but this simple meal felt weighted with significance he didn't quite understand. Through the window, he could see Clara's figure moving down the darkening street, her long coat making her almost invisible in the gathering dusk. He watched until she turned the corner and disappeared from view, and even then he continued to stand there, lamp in hand, staring at the empty street. Finally, he set down the lamp and returned to his counter. The ledger still lay where he'd dropped it when Clara first appeared. He picked it up, smoothed the bent pages, then set it aside. The inventory could wait. Everything could wait. Because Clara Whitmore, the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd mourned, the woman who had haunted the corners of his life for 40 years, had come back from the mountains. And Daniel Carter, despite everything, despite the anger and hurt and bewilderment, had no idea what came next. He only knew that something had shifted. Something had begun. And after 40 years of ending, that was more than he'd ever expected to feel again. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay in the darkness of his bedroom, staring at ceiling beams he'd memorized decades ago, and listened to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of his house. But every noise seemed amplified. Every shadow took on new significance, because somewhere across town, in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Clara Whitmore was doing the same thing, lying awake in the darkness, breathing the air of a town she'd abandoned 40 years ago. When gray dawn finally crept through his window, Daniel rose and dressed with mechanical precision. His hands knew the routine. The same shirt he wore every day, the same suspenders, the same worn boots. But nothing felt the same. The face that stared back at him from the small mirror above his washstand belonged to a stranger caught between past and present, unable to fully inhabit either. He made coffee in the kitchen, the rich smell filling the quiet house. Sarah had always loved the first cup of morning coffee, would wrap her hands around the warm mug and smile at him over the rim. The memory came without warning, and with it a complicated tangle of guilt. What would Sarah think of yesterday's revelation? What would she say about the ghost who had finally taken solid form? The coffee turned bitter on his tongue. By the time Elizabeth arrived at the store an hour later, Daniel had already swept the floors, restocked 2 shelves, and reorganized the storeroom with more energy than necessary. His daughter took one look at his face and set down her ledger with deliberate care. "What happened?" she asked. Elizabeth had her mother's dark eyes, but Daniel's sharp features and direct manner. At 35, she'd become indispensable to the store's operation, handling accounts and suppliers with an efficiency that often left Daniel feeling obsolete. She was also perceptive in ways that made hiding things from her nearly impossible. "Nothing," Daniel said automatically. "Father," Elizabeth crossed her arms. "You look like you've been run over by a freight wagon. Either tell me what's wrong, or I'll start guessing, and you won't like my guesses." Daniel set down the box he'd been unpacking and rubbed his face with both hands. The truth was going to come out anyway. In a town this size, secrets had a half-life measured in hours, not days. "Clara Whitmore came back," he said quietly. Elizabeth went very still. "What?" "Yesterday evening, she walked into the store just before closing. Clara Whitmore." Elizabeth spoke the name slowly as if testing its weight. "The woman who disappeared 40 years ago. That Clara Whitmore." "Yes, she's alive." "Very much so." Elizabeth pulled out a chair and sat down with the careful movements of someone who'd just had the ground shift beneath their feet. "Where has she been?" "The mountains. Living alone, mostly. She came back yesterday." "After 40 years," Elizabeth said. "She just walked in and, what, said hello?" "Something like that." His daughter studied him with those sharp, dark eyes, seeing far more than Daniel wanted to reveal. "How do you feel about this?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. The honesty surprised him, but Elizabeth had always had a way of drawing truth from him. Angry, confused. "I spent 40 years believing she was dead, building a life without her, and now she's back, and everything I thought I understood about what happened is—" He gestured helplessly. "Different." "Different how?" Daniel told her about the conversation, leaving out the more painful details but giving her the essential truth. Clara had left because she felt trapped. She'd spent 4 decades in the wilderness. She'd come back because she couldn't carry the weight of regret anymore. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her expression growing more complex with each revelation. When Daniel finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "She watched you search for her," Elizabeth finally said, her voice tight with anger. "She was close enough to see you, and she let you suffer." "Yes. That's cruel, Father. Whatever her reasons, that's unforgivably cruel." "I know. And now she wants what? Forgiveness? A second chance?" "I'm not sure what she wants," Daniel said. "She claims she doesn't expect anything." "But she came back." Elizabeth leaned forward, her gaze intense. "People don't come back after 40 years without wanting something, even if they won't admit it to themselves." The insight struck Daniel as uncomfortably accurate. "What would you do?" he asked. "If you were me?" Elizabeth was quiet, considering. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, painting the street in golden light. A wagon rattled past, and someone called a greeting. The ordinary world continued, indifferent to the extraordinary questions unfolding inside the store. "I'd be careful," Elizabeth finally said. "This woman broke your heart once. She could do it again." "She's 62 years old and exhausted from 4 decades of living alone in the wilderness," Daniel said. "I'm not sure she has the energy to break anyone's heart." "Don't underestimate what people are capable of when they're desperate," Elizabeth replied. "Especially people who've spent 40 years running from their own choices." Before Daniel could respond, the bell above the door chimed. They both turned, and Daniel felt his breath catch. Clara stood in the doorway, morning light framing her weathered form. She'd changed clothes, traded her dust-stained coat for a simple dress that hung loose on her lean frame. Her gray-streaked hair had been freshly braided. She looked slightly less exhausted than yesterday, but still carried herself with that odd combination of strength and fragility. Her gray eyes went from Daniel to Elizabeth and back again. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I can come back later if this is a bad time." "No," Daniel heard himself say. "Come in." Clara stepped inside, moving with that same economical grace. She stopped a respectful distance from the counter, her hands clasped in front of her. Elizabeth stood, her posture defensive. "You're Clara Whitmore." "I am." Clara met Elizabeth's gaze steadily. "And you must be Elizabeth." "How do you know my name?" "Your father told me yesterday. He spoke of all his children." Elizabeth's expression didn't soften. "Did he also tell you what your disappearance did to him? How he searched until he was half dead from exhaustion? How he blamed himself for years, thinking he'd somehow failed you?" "Elizabeth," Daniel said quietly. "No, Father, she should know." Elizabeth turned back to Clara, her dark eyes blazing. "You don't get to walk back into his life and pretend the past 40 years didn't happen. You don't get to show up and expect understanding." Clara absorbed the words without flinching. "You're right," she said simply. "I don't expect understanding or forgiveness. I came to apologize, nothing more." "Apologies don't undo damage." "No, they don't." Clara's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes, pain or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. "Your father mentioned you were prickly. I see he understated the matter." Despite everything, Daniel felt the corners of his mouth twitch. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "I'm protective," Elizabeth corrected. "There's a difference." "There is," Clara agreed, "and your father is lucky to have someone so fiercely in his corner." The acknowledgement seemed to surprise Elizabeth. She studied Clara with visible reassessment, taking in the weathered features, the scars, the evidence of hard living. "You've been in the mountains this whole time?" Elizabeth asked, her tone still challenging but less hostile. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "That's insane." A faint smile touched Clara's lips. "Probably, but it was my particular kind of insanity." Elizabeth glanced at Daniel, then back to Clara. "I need to check the storeroom inventory," she said abruptly. "Father, can you manage the counter?" It was a transparent excuse to give them privacy, and all 3 of them knew it. Daniel nodded, and Elizabeth disappeared into the back room, though Daniel suspected she'd be listening to every word. Clara moved closer to the counter, her movements careful. In the morning light, Daniel could see new details. The way her fingers were slightly crooked, probably from breaks that hadn't healed properly, the deep line of an old scar disappearing beneath her collar. "You have a remarkable daughter," Clara said quietly. "I know. She reminds me of myself at that age, before I left." "That's what worries me." Clara's smile turned sad. "You're afraid she'll leave too." "The thought has crossed my mind." Daniel studied Clara's face. "Did you sleep?" "Some. The bed was softer than I'm used to. I kept waking up thinking I was falling." "How long since you slept in a real bed?" Clara considered. 15 years, maybe. I built a platform in one of my shelters, but it was pine boughs and hides, nothing like a mattress. The casual mention of such deprivation struck Daniel harder than he expected. "Why did you come to the store this morning?" "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again," Clara admitted. "After yesterday, after everything I told you. But I couldn't leave town without—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to see you one more time." "You're leaving?" "I don't know. I don't have a plan, Daniel. I came here because I couldn't not come. But I didn't think beyond that." Daniel found himself studying her hands on the counter, scarred, calloused, marked by decades of hard use. These weren't the soft hands of the young woman he'd known. These were survivor's hands. "Tell me about the mountains," he said suddenly. Clara looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. I need to know what was worth 40 years of your life." She was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes distant. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality he'd never heard before. Not quite longing, but something close. "The first winter nearly killed me," she began. "I'd watched trappers and mountain men, thought I understood what survival required. I was arrogant and ignorant in equal measure." She paused. "I built a shelter in a valley that seemed protected, but I didn't account for avalanche paths. In February, snow came down the mountain and buried everything. I dug myself out with my bare hands and walked 3 days through waist-deep snow to find another camp." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You could have died." "Yes, I should have died probably, but I learned." Claire's fingers traced an absent pattern on the counter. "I learned to read weather in the color of the sky, to find water by watching birds, to predict animal behavior by the season and the moon. The mountains taught me in the only language they know, survival or death." "That sounds brutal." "It was. But it was also freedom." Clara met his eyes. Freedom from expectations, from judgment, from the constant weight of other people's ideas about who I should be. In the mountains, I could just exist. No one cared if I was pretty or proper or domestic. The only thing that mattered was whether I could survive another day. "And that was enough for you? Just survival?" "For a long time, yes." Claire's voice softened. "But somewhere along the way, I realized that surviving isn't the same as living. I'd become so good at being alone that I'd forgotten what it meant to be human." "What changed?" Clara looked away, her gaze going to the window and the street beyond. "Last year, I was camped in a high meadow. I'd been tracking an elk for 3 days, needed the meat for winter stores. I finally got close enough for a clean shot." She paused. "But just as I was about to release the arrow, I heard myself laugh, out loud, for no reason. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard the sound of laughter, anyone's laughter, including my own. The image was so vivid, so lonely, that Daniel felt something shift in his chest. I stood there in that meadow," Clara continued, "arrow knocked, elk grazing 50 yards away, and I couldn't stop laughing. It wasn't happy laughter, it was the sound of something breaking." She turned back to face him. "That's when I knew I had to come back. Not to reclaim what I'd lost. That's impossible. But to at least acknowledge what I'd done. To you, to myself." Daniel absorbed the story, trying to reconcile this weathered, philosophical woman with the restless girl who'd disappeared decades ago. "You said you saw me search that first winter." "Yes." "Where were you camped?" "North ridge of Harper's Peak. There's a series of caves about halfway up. Good shelter, fresh water, game trails nearby." Daniel knew the area. He'd ridden past it dozens of times during those desperate months of searching. "I was probably within 2 miles of you." "Closer." "There was one day, it was snowing, late afternoon. You rode right past the base of the ridge. I watched you from the cave entrance. You looked so cold and tired." Clara's voice dropped. "I almost called out. Almost ended the whole thing right there." Why didn't you? Because I knew if I saw you up close, if I had to look you in the eyes, I'd lose my nerve. I'd come back and everything I was afraid of would happen anyway, just delayed. So you stayed hidden and let me suffer. Yes. The simple admission again, unflinching in its honesty. I've relived that moment 1,000 times, played out what would have happened if I'd called to you. Sometimes I think it would have saved us both decades of pain. Other times I think it would have just created a different kind of pain. Before Daniel could respond, Elizabeth emerged from the storeroom. She carried a ledger but set it down with exaggerated care, a clear signal that she'd heard enough. I need to go to the post office, Elizabeth announced. Then I'm meeting with the dry goods supplier. I'll be back this afternoon. She didn't wait for Daniel's acknowledgement, just grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. But she paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at Clara. My mother was a good woman, Elizabeth said quietly, kind and patient and strong in ways most people never saw. She made my father happy, gave him a family, built a life with him. Whatever you're hoping to find here, remember that her memory deserves respect. Clara met Elizabeth's gaze steadily. I'm not here to replace anyone. That would be impossible, even if I wanted to. Elizabeth studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and left. The bell chimed her departure, leaving Daniel and Clara alone in the morning quiet store. She's very protective of you, Clara observed. She has reason to be. Daniel moved around the counter, suddenly needing to do something with his hands. He began straightening jars on a shelf, pickles, preserves, jams that didn't need straightening. After Sarah died, Elizabeth took care of me, made sure I ate, kept the house running, dragged me back to the living when I wanted to disappear into grief. You loved Sarah very much. It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. I did. Differently than I loved you, but deeply. She was steady where you were restless, content where you were hungry for more. She made peace with the world instead of fighting it. And you needed that, Clara said, after I left. Yes. Daniel turned to face her. But I need you to understand something, Clara. What Sarah and I had, it wasn't second best. It wasn't me settling because I couldn't have you. We built something real together, something good. I know. Clara's voice was gentle. I'm glad you had that, Daniel. Truly. The thought of you being happy with her was the only thing that made the guilt bearable sometimes. Then why come back and complicate everything? The question hung between them, raw and necessary. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful. Because being bearable isn't the same as being resolved, she finally said. I carried you with me every single day for 40 years. Your face was the last thing I saw before sleep, and the first thing I thought of when I woke. I tried to let you go, tried to convince myself that time and distance would erase what we had. But it didn't work. She paused. Coming back isn't about complicating your life. It's about finally laying down a burden I've carried for too long. And then what? You disappear again? I don't know. Clara's honesty was becoming familiar, though no less frustrating. I don't have a plan, Daniel. I came here with enough money for a week at the boarding house and no thoughts beyond apologizing to you. A week? Daniel repeated. And then? Back to the mountains, I suppose. It's the only life I know anymore. The thought of her returning to that brutal isolation stirred something unexpected in Daniel's chest. He tried to tell himself it was simple human compassion. Anyone would feel sympathy for a 62-year-old woman planning to return to decades of solitude. But he knew it was more complicated than that. What would you do if you stayed? He heard himself ask. Clara looked at him sharply. What? If you stayed in town, what would you do? I seemed genuinely caught off guard. I haven't considered that possibility. Consider it now. She studied him, trying to read his intentions. Why? Because I'm trying to understand what you want, Daniel said. You came back to apologize, to lay down your burden. Fine. But what happens after that? Do you just walk away again? Go back to being alone until you die in some remote valley where no one will ever find you? The brutal picture he painted made Clara flinch. I don't expect to live much longer anyway. The mountains are hard on the body. That's not an answer. No, Clara admitted. It's an evasion. She took a slow breath. The truth is, I don't know if I could stay. I've been alone so long that being around people feels wrong. Like wearing clothes that don't fit anymore. Even standing here talking to you, part of me wants to bolt for the door. But you're still here. Yes. Why? Clara's gray eyes held his, and he saw vulnerability there that cut through decades of distance. Because the other part of me, the part I've been trying to ignore for 40 years, never wanted to leave in the first place, she said quietly. That part stayed with you, Daniel. It stayed in this store, in this town, in the life I walked away from. And now that I'm back, that part is louder than it's been in decades. The confession sent Daniel's carefully maintained composure cracking. He gripped the edge of the shelf behind him, needing something solid to anchor to. You can't say things like that, he said, his voice rough. Not after 40 years, not after everything. I know, I'm sorry, but you asked for honesty. There's honest and there's cruel. Sometimes they're the same thing. Daniel laughed, the sound harsh and unexpected. You always had a way of turning conversations inside out. Some things don't change. And some things do. Clara gestured to herself. I'm not the woman you knew, Daniel. 40 years changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I don't know if I could be part of ordinary life again. Don't know if I could sit in church or attend social gatherings or make polite conversation about weather and harvests. I'm not asking you to, Daniel said. I'm just asking if you've thought about what comes next. Every minute since I walked into this store yesterday, Clara admitted, I've thought about staying, about finding work, maybe as a seamstress or laundress, about renting a small room and learning to be part of the world again. She paused. But I've also thought about how impossible that seems. How the mountains are still calling to me, even now. How being around people makes my skin feel too tight. What do you want, Clara? Deep down, what do you actually want? The question seemed to take all the air from the room. Clara stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides, her weathered face working through emotions too complex to name. I want the impossible, she finally whispered. I want to go back 40 years and make a different choice. I want to be 22 again and brave enough to stay. I want to have built a life with you, raised children, grown old by your side. Her voice cracked. But since I can't have that, since I destroyed it with my own fear and selfishness, I want... She stopped, her composure finally breaking. I don't know what I want, Daniel. I just know that being here, seeing you, talking to you, it hurts in ways the mountains never did. Daniel watched a tear slide down her weathered cheek, the first emotion she'd allowed herself to show beyond quiet composure. The sight of it broke something in him that had been holding firm since yesterday. He moved before thinking, crossing the space between them and pulling her into his arms. Clara went rigid with surprise, then slowly, hesitantly, leaned into the embrace. She smelled of soap and leather, and something wild that 40 years in the mountains had embedded in her skin. Daniel felt her shaking, whether from tears or exhaustion or simply the shock of human contact, he couldn't tell. I don't forgive you, he said quietly against her hair. I'm not sure I can, but I don't want you to go back to the mountains and die alone. Clara's arms came up slowly, carefully, until she was holding him too. What do you want? Time, Daniel said. Time to figure out what this is, what we are now, if we're anything at all. I might disappoint you again. You probably will. Daniel felt a strange laugh building in his chest, but at least this time I'll see it coming. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had once loved each other trying to bridge a gap 4 decades wide. Finally, Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Neither do I, Daniel said. But maybe we figure it out together. Clara nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in her gray eyes. One day at a time? One day at a time, Daniel agreed. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a customer. They stepped apart quickly, too quickly, like people caught doing something they shouldn't. Mrs. Patterson entered, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious curiosity. Morning, Daniel, she said, her gaze sliding to Clara. And you must be the new woman staying at Henderson's boarding house. Yes, ma'am, Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. Interesting, Mrs. Patterson said, drawing out the word. Very interesting indeed. Daniel suppressed a sigh. By noon, half the town would know Clara was back. By evening, the other half would have their own theories about why. There was no stopping it now. The day continued with the rhythm of ordinary commerce, customers coming and going, goods exchanged, small talk made. But underneath the surface normalcy, everything had changed. Clara stayed, helping in small ways, reorganizing shelves with the efficiency of someone who understood inventory, measuring out flour and sugar with practiced hands. She moved through the store like a ghost learning to be solid again. And Daniel watched her, seeing both the girl he'd loved and the stranger she'd become, wondering if somewhere in the space between those two versions of Clara Whitmore, there might be room for something new. By the third day, the entire town knew Clara Whitmore had returned from the dead. The news spread like wildfire through the small frontier community, jumping from household to household with the speed and enthusiasm of scandal. In the mercantile, women lingered over fabric selections they didn't need, their eyes sliding toward Clara as she quietly restocked shelves. At the blacksmith shop, men paused in their work to watch her pass on the street. Even the children stared, whispering to each other about the strange woman who'd lived in the mountains for 40 years. Daniel felt the weight of their collective curiosity like a physical thing. Every conversation stopped when he entered a room. Every greeting carried an unspoken question. The town wanted to know what would happen next, and he had no answer to give them. Clara seemed to feel it too. She moved through the store with increasing tension in her shoulders, her movements becoming more careful, more controlled. On the fourth morning, when she arrived just after dawn, Daniel noticed her hands were shaking. "How many people asked you questions yesterday?" he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her weathered hands around its warmth. 7, by my count. Mrs. Patterson cornered me at the dry goods counter. She wanted to know where exactly I'd been living and whether I'd encountered any hostile tribes. What did you tell her? The truth, that I kept to myself and bothered no one. Clara took a sip of coffee, her gray eyes distant. She seemed disappointed. I think she was hoping for stories of dramatic rescues or dangerous encounters. People here love their drama, Daniel said, especially when it involves someone who disappeared 40 years ago. Do you regret it? Clara asked suddenly. Letting me stay? I'm causing talk. Daniel considered the question while measuring out sugar for a customer's order. The truth was complicated. Yes, Clara's presence had disrupted the quiet routine of his life. Yes, the constant speculation and gossip grated on his nerves. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, with her weathered face and cautious hope, he couldn't bring himself to wish her gone. I don't regret it, he said finally. But I think we need to be prepared for things to get more complicated. How much more complicated can it get? As if in answer, the door opened and Thomas Carter walked in. Daniel's eldest son was a solid man of 40, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's build. He ran the family ranch with quiet competence and visited town every week for supplies. But the expression on his face this morning suggested this wasn't a routine visit. His eyes went immediately to Clara. So it's true, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. You're really back. Clara set down her coffee cup, her posture straightening. I am. Thomas looked at his father. Can we talk? Privately? Daniel felt Clara tense beside him. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Clara. Can I? Thomas's jaw tightened. Because I'm not sure I want to be polite right now. Thomas? No, it's all right, Clara interrupted quietly. He has every right to be angry. Thomas turned his full attention to Clara, and Daniel saw decades of protective instinct crystallizing into confrontation. You left my father. You disappeared without explanation and let him believe you were dead. He searched for you until he was half broken, then spent years rebuilding himself. My mother helped him do that. She gave him love and family and stability. And now you show up and… what? Expect to just slide back into his life? I expect nothing, Clara said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. I came to apologize. Nothing more. Apologies don't undo 40 years of damage. No, they don't. Clara met Thomas's angry gaze without flinching. But they're all I have to offer. Then offer them and leave, Thomas said bluntly. Go back to wherever you've been and let my father live in peace. Thomas, that's enough, Daniel said sharply. Is it? Thomas turned to his father, frustration evident in every line of his body. She hurt you, Pa. She destroyed you. I was only a boy, but I remember. I remember how you'd come home from searching and just sit by the fire staring at nothing. I remember Ma trying to reach you, trying to pull you back to the living. It took years before you smiled again." His voice dropped. "And now she's back, and I see the way you look at her, and I'm afraid—" He stopped, his throat working. "Afraid of what?" Daniel asked gently. "That she'll hurt you again," Thomas said roughly. "That she'll take what little peace you've found and destroy it all over again." The raw honesty in his son's voice struck Daniel harder than any anger could have. He moved around the counter and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I appreciate your concern," Daniel said quietly. "But I'm not a boy anymore, and neither are you. I can make my own decisions about who I spend time with. Even if those decisions are foolish? Even then." Thomas looked at Clara again, his expression a complicated mix of anger and something that might have been fear. "What do you want from him?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that silenced any interruption. "I want to know if it is possible to undo some of the damage I caused," she said. "I want to find out if there's anything left between us that 40 years couldn't completely destroy. And if there isn't, if I've killed whatever we had, then I want to at least leave your father with answers instead of ghosts." She paused. "But what I want doesn't matter as much as what he needs. And if he needs me to leave, I will." She looked at Daniel as she said this last part, her gray eyes asking a question she didn't voice. Daniel felt the weight of his son's concern and Clara's vulnerability pressing on him from different directions. The easy answer would be to ask Clara to leave, to preserve the peace Thomas was so worried about. But the easy answer had never been his way. "She stays," Daniel said firmly, "for as long as she wants." Thomas's face tightened. "Pa, I know you're trying to protect me," Daniel interrupted, "but I don't need protection. What I need is to figure this out for myself, to understand what happened and what it means now." He squeezed his son's shoulder. "Can you trust me to do that?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his father and Clara. Finally he nodded, though the tension didn't leave his posture. "All right," Thomas said. "But if she hurts you again, she'll answer to me." "Fair enough," Clara said quietly. Thomas gave her one last hard look, then turned and left without another word. The door closed behind him with more force than necessary, the bell chiming sharply. Clara let out a slow breath. "That went better than I expected." Despite everything, Daniel felt a laugh escape. "That was better?" "He didn't throw me out bodily," Clara said. "I count that as a victory." They stood in the quiet store, morning light streaming through the windows, and Daniel felt the weight of what had just happened settling over him. Thomas's words echoed in his mind, the reminder of how broken he'd been, how long it had taken to heal, how much Sarah had sacrificed to help him do it. "He's right, you know," Daniel said quietly. "About what you did to me." Clara nodded. "I know." "So why are you still here? Why put yourself through this?" "Because running away didn't work," Clara said. "I spent 40 years trying to escape what I did, and it followed me every step. At least here, facing it, I have a chance to make some kind of peace with it. And if you can't, if there's no peace to be made," Clara's smile was sad and small, "then at least I tried." The door opened again, and Elizabeth entered carrying a basket of correspondence. She took one look at their faces and set the basket down with a sigh. "Thomas was here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "How bad?" "Protective? Angry? Worried?" Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised. "Mary will be next. She heard the news from Mrs. Patterson's daughter. Expect her sometime this afternoon." She looked at Clara. "You should prepare yourself. Mary's more diplomatic than Thomas, but she feels things just as deeply." "I understand," Clara said. Elizabeth studied her for a moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "Come with me," she said to Clara. "There's something you should see." Clara glanced at Daniel, who nodded. She followed Elizabeth toward the back of the store, where a narrow staircase led to the living quarters above. Daniel watched them go, then turned his attention to the morning's work, though his mind remained upstairs with the two women. Elizabeth led Clara to a small room that had once been Sarah's sewing space. Sunlight fell through the window onto a chair positioned near a basket of fabric scraps. On the wall hung a series of framed photographs, formal family portraits capturing moments across decades. "This was my mother's favorite room," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "She'd sit here in the afternoons and work on quilts or mend clothing, said the light was perfect." Clara stood very still, looking at the photographs. In them, she could see the life she'd walked away from, rendered in silver and shadow. Daniel as a younger man, his face unlined but his eyes carrying a weight she recognized. Sarah beside him, serene and steady. 3 children growing across the years. Thomas serious even as a boy, Mary with her mother's gentle smile, Elizabeth with her father's sharp gaze. "They were beautiful," Clara said quietly. "They were real," Elizabeth corrected. "This wasn't some second-choice consolation prize. This was my father's actual life, his real love, his family." "I know." "Do you?" Elizabeth moved to stand beside Clara, both of them looking at the photographs. "Because sometimes I wonder if you understand what you cost him. Not just the heartbreak of losing you, but the years of guilt and self-blame that followed. He convinced himself he'd failed you somehow, that there was something he should have done differently." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "That was never his fault. We know that now. But he didn't know it for years. Even after he married my mother, even after we were born, there was a part of him that carried that weight." Elizabeth paused. "My mother knew. She never said anything, but she knew there was a ghost in their marriage, and she loved him enough to accept it." "Your mother was a better person than I could ever be," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, she was." Elizabeth's bluntness might have been cruel if not for the gentleness in her tone. "But that doesn't mean you're evil or unforgivable. It just means you made a choice that had consequences beyond what you imagined." Clara turned to face Elizabeth directly. "Why are you telling me this? Why show me these photographs?" "Because I need you to understand what you're walking into," Elizabeth said. "My father looks at you and sees the woman he loved 40 years ago. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. She hasn't existed for decades. You're someone different now. He's someone different. And whatever happens between you needs to be based on who you actually are, not who you used to be." The insight struck Clara with unexpected force. She looked back at the photographs, at the evidence of a full life lived without her, and felt the truth of Elizabeth's words settle deep in her bones. "You're very wise for 35, Clara said. "I've had good teachers." Elizabeth moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. If you hurt him again, if you make promises you can't keep or raise hopes you can't fulfill, I won't be as forgiving as Thomas." "Noted," Clara said. Elizabeth left, and Clara stood alone in Sarah's sewing room, surrounded by the ghost of the life she'd refused. The afternoon light painted everything in gold, and she could almost imagine Sarah sitting in the chair by the window, needle moving through fabric with patient precision, building something lasting from scraps and thread. She found Daniel downstairs, helping a customer select tools. When the customer left, he looked at her questioningly. "Elizabeth showed me Sarah's room," Clara said. "The photographs." Daniel's expression softened. "What did you think?" "That you built something remarkable. That Sarah was lucky to have you, and you were lucky to have her." Clara paused. "And that Elizabeth is right. I'm not the woman you knew 40 years ago. I'm not the man you knew either," Daniel said. "We're both different people now." "Then what are we doing, Daniel? Why are we pretending there might be something here?" The question hung between them, sharp and necessary. Daniel set down the tools he'd been organizing and came around the counter to stand before her. "Because maybe there is," he said quietly, "not what we had before. That's gone and can't be recovered. But maybe something new, something built on who we actually are now, not who we were." "That's a risk," Clara said, "for both of us." "Yes, it is." Daniel held her gaze. "But I've spent 40 years playing it safe. Building a good life, yes, but always wondering. Always carrying that question of what might have been. I don't want to die still wondering." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know if I can be what you need." "I don't know if you can either," Daniel admitted. "But maybe that's something we figure out together." Before Clara could respond, the door opened and a woman in her late 30s entered. She had Sarah's gentle features and Daniel's height, and her eyes went immediately to Clara with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Mary," Daniel said, his voice carrying both welcome and resignation. "I was expecting you. Mary Carter Harrison moved with deliberate grace, her hands folded in front of her as she approached. Unlike Thomas's immediate anger, she radiated a careful control that was somehow more intimidating. "Father," she said, kissing Daniel's cheek. Then she turned to Clara. "And you must be Clara Whitmore." "I am," Clara said, bracing herself. Mary studied her with eyes that saw too much. "My mother used to tell me stories about you. She said you were the bravest person she'd ever heard of, to give up everything and walk away into the unknown." The unexpected perspective left Clara momentarily speechless. "That's generous of her." "My mother was generous with everyone," Mary said. "Sometimes too generous. She saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it." She paused. "But she also said you must have been terrified of something to run that hard and that far. She wondered what scared you so badly." Clara felt the observation cut through her defenses. "I was terrified of disappearing, of becoming invisible inside a life that felt like a cage." "And did you find what you were looking for in the mountains?" "I found freedom," Clara said, "and loneliness, and regret. I found out that running away from fear doesn't make you brave. It just makes you alone." Mary absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "My father loved my mother very much. She was his anchor, his peace. When she died, I thought he might die too, but he survived, partly because he'd learned how to keep living after losing someone he loved." Her gaze sharpened. "He's already survived losing you once. I won't stand by and watch him have to do it again." "I understand," Clara said. "Do you?" Mary stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you came back out of guilt or loneliness, seeking absolution or comfort. But my father isn't a priest to grant forgiveness or a cure for your isolation. He's a man who's built a life after you destroyed his first one. And whatever happens between you needs to be about more than just easing your conscience." The words were delivered with Sarah's gentleness, but carried Thomas's protective fury underneath. Clara felt them land like blows, each one accurate and deserved. "You're right," Clara said quietly. "I did come back seeking something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe just understanding. But being here, seeing your father, talking to him, I've realized it's more complicated than that. I'm not sure what I'm seeking anymore. I only know that walking away again feels impossible." "Then you'd better figure it out," Mary said, "because my father deserves clarity, not confusion. He deserves someone who knows what they want and can commit to it, not someone who's still running, even while standing still." With that, Mary turned to her father. "I'll be at the ranch this weekend. Come for Sunday dinner?" "Of course," Daniel said. Mary kissed his cheek again, nodded once to Clara, and left with the same deliberate grace with which she'd entered. The silence after her departure felt heavy. Clara moved to the window, looking out at the street where people went about their ordinary business, unaware of the complicated drama unfolding inside Carter's General Store. "Your children are very protective of you," Clara observed. "They have reason to be," Daniel said, coming to stand beside her. "I'm sorry if that was difficult." "It was necessary," Clara corrected. "They're right to question my motives. I've been questioning them myself." She turned to face him. "Mary asked what scared me so badly that I ran. You asked me that too the first day, but I don't think I gave you the real answer." "What's the real answer?" Clara took a slow breath, gathering courage. "I was scared of becoming my mother. She was brilliant and passionate when she was young. Everyone said so. But then she married my father and had children, and slowly, year by year, I watched her disappear. She stopped reading, stopped having opinions, stopped being anything except a wife and mother. By the time I was 15, I couldn't remember what her dreams had been, and I don't think she could either." "Well," Daniel listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. "I looked at her," Clara continued, "and then I looked at the life waiting for me, and I panicked. Because I loved you, Daniel. I loved you so much it terrified me. And I knew that if I married you, if I stayed, I would do exactly what my mother did. I would slowly erase myself to fit into the shape of your life. And 20 years later, I'd wake up and not recognize the woman in the mirror." "You thought I would ask that of you," Daniel said quietly. "No, I thought I would do it to myself without you asking." Clara's voice cracked slightly. "That was the terrible truth I couldn't face back then. The cage wasn't you or this town or the expectations. The cage was me. My own inability to figure out how to be myself and belong to someone else at the same time. The confession hung between them, more honest than anything Clara had said before. Daniel reached out slowly and took her weathered hand in his. "And now?" he asked. "Do you still feel that way?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I spent 40 years being only myself, beholden to no one, answerable to nothing but survival. I learned how to be free, but I never learned how to be free and connected at the same time. I still don't know if that's possible." "Maybe we could learn together," Daniel said. "You keep saying that, but what if I can't learn? What if I try and fail and hurt you all over again?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. The gesture was so gentle, so familiar despite decades of absence, that Clara felt tears threaten. "When Sarah was dying," Daniel said slowly, "she made me promise something. She made me promise that I wouldn't let fear keep me from living. She said she'd watched me carry the weight of losing you for too long, and she didn't want me to carry the weight of losing her the same way." He looked up, met Clara's eyes. "She told me that love, real love, is always a risk, and that the only thing worse than taking that risk and failing is never taking it at all." She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. She was. Daniel's smile was sad and fond, and she would have liked you, I think. Would have seen past the fear to the person underneath. Clara felt a sob building in her chest. "I don't deserve her kindness." "Probably not," Daniel agreed. "But she would have given it anyway. That's who she was." They stood together in the afternoon light, hands clasped, while outside the world continued its ordinary rhythms. Somewhere in town, Thomas was probably complaining to his wife about his father's foolishness. Mary was likely composing careful arguments for Sunday dinner. Elizabeth was handling customers with her usual efficiency while keeping one eye on the door, ready to defend if necessary. And here, in the quiet store, two people who had loved each other 40 years ago were trying to figure out if there was anything left to build on besides memory and regret. "I'm scared," Clara whispered. "So am I," Daniel admitted. "What do we do with that?" "We keep going anyway," Daniel said, "one day at a time, like we agreed. We figure out who we are now and whether those people can find a way to fit together." Clara nodded slowly, then did something that surprised them both. She stepped forward and rested her head against Daniel's shoulder, letting herself be held for the first time in 40 years. His arms came around her carefully, as if she might bolt like a wild animal. But she didn't bolt. She stayed, breathing in the scent of him, coffee and leather and something uniquely Daniel that 40 years hadn't erased from her memory. And she felt something inside her begin to loosen, some tight knot of fear and guilt that had lived in her chest for decades. "I don't know how to do this," she said against his shoulder. "Neither do I," Daniel said. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe not knowing is part of it." They stood like that until the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. They stepped apart quickly, both of them slightly flushed, and Daniel went to help while Clara retreated to the storeroom to compose herself. She leaned against the shelves, her heart pounding, and realized with startling clarity that she was more terrified now than she'd been facing down a grizzly bear in the high country. Because bears were simple. You fought or you fled. But this thing with Daniel, this tentative possibility of connection, required something far more frightening than simple survival. It required trust. It required vulnerability. It required believing that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to belong without disappearing. And Clara wasn't sure she knew how to do that. But as she heard Daniel's voice in the front room, helping a customer with patient kindness, she thought that maybe learning was possible. Maybe after 40 years of running, she could finally stand still long enough to find out. The week that followed became a careful dance between past and present, between what had been and what might be. Clara continued to help at the store, her presence slowly becoming less shocking to the townspeople and more simply part of the daily rhythm. She learned the inventory system, memorized customer preferences, discovered she had a knack for organizing the cluttered storeroom that Daniel had been meaning to tackle for years. But the real work happened in the quiet moments between customers, in the conversations that stretched across the counter like bridges being built plank by careful plank. On the 8th day, Daniel found Clara sitting on the porch behind the store as the sun set, her weathered face turned toward the distant mountains that had been her home for so long. He brought 2 cups of coffee and settled beside her on the wooden step. "Do you miss it?" he asked, gesturing toward the peaks that rose purple and gold in the fading light. Clara considered the question, her gray eyes tracking the familiar ridges and valleys she knew better than any map. "Every day," she admitted. "The silence, the simplicity, knowing exactly what each day would require of me." "You could go back." "I could." She took the coffee he offered, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "But I won't. Not yet, anyway." "Why not?" Clara looked at him, and Daniel saw something vulnerable in her expression. "Because, for the first time in 40 years, I'm not sure running away is the answer anymore." They sat in comfortable silence while the sky deepened through shades of orange and red. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Laughter drifted from an open window, the ordinary sounds of a town settling into evening. "Tell me about your worst moment," Clara said suddenly. "In all those years after I left, what was the hardest?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He sipped his coffee, watching the light fade, and let his mind drift back through decades of memory to find the truth she was asking for. "The second anniversary," he finally said, "of the day you disappeared. I'd convinced myself that I was healing, that I'd moved past it. Sarah and I had been married for 6 months. She was pregnant with Thomas. Everything should have been good." "But it wasn't," Clara said softly. "No." Daniel's voice dropped. "I woke up that morning, and the first thing I thought was that it had been exactly 2 years since I'd seen your face. And I realized that even though I loved Sarah, even though I was building a new life, part of me was still waiting for you to come back, still listening for your voice, still turning at every door expecting to see you walk through." Clara's hands tightened on her cup. "I'm sorry. I went out to the ridge that day," Daniel continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "The place where we used to meet when we were courting, do you remember?" "The oak tree with the split trunk," Clara said, "where you could see the whole valley." "Yes." Daniel smiled sadly at the memory. "I rode out there and sat under that tree for hours, and I let myself be angry, really angry, for the first time since you'd left. I cursed you, I cursed myself, I cursed the whole situation." He paused. "And then I rode home and told Sarah everything. About you, about us, about the fact that I was still carrying you with me, even though I'd promised her a fresh start." "What did she say?" "She said she already knew." Daniel's voice roughened with emotion. "She said she'd known from the beginning that she was marrying a man with a ghost in his heart. And she said that was all right, as long as I promised to keep trying to live anyway." Tears slid silently down Clara's weathered cheeks. "She was too good for both of us." "Yes, she was." Daniel set down his cup and took Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "But she also understood something I didn't back then. She understood that people can hold multiple truths at the same time, that I could love her and still grieve you, that I could build a good life while still wondering about the one I'd lost." "I robbed you of peace," Clara whispered. "You robbed me of certainty," Daniel corrected. "But Sarah taught me that maybe certainty isn't as important as we think. Maybe it's possible to live well with questions as long as you don't let them paralyze you." They sat together as full darkness fell, their hands clasped, while the town settled into sleep around them. Inside the store, a lamp burned in the window, casting warm light onto the street. It was such an ordinary scene, 2 people sitting together in the evening quiet, but beneath it ran currents 4 decades deep. "What was your worst moment?" Daniel asked. "In the mountains?" Clara was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The winter I turned 45, she said. "I'd been gone for 23 years by then. I was camped in a valley I'd used before, good shelter and game nearby. But that winter was brutal. The snow came early and stayed late, and I ran through my supplies faster than expected." She paused, her fingers tightening around Daniel's. "By February I was starving. Really starving, not just hungry. I couldn't hunt because the game had moved to lower elevations. I was too weak to travel far, so I just sat in my shelter and waited to die." Her voice cracked. "And the whole time, all I could think about was that I was going to die alone in a frozen valley, and no one would ever know. No one would find my body. I would just disappear completely, as if I'd never existed at all." "But you survived," Daniel said. "The weather broke. The game came back. I recovered." Clara looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But I never forgot what it felt like to realize that my freedom, the thing I'd sacrificed everything for, meant that my death wouldn't matter to anyone, that I could vanish from the world and leave no mark at all. You left a mark, Daniel said quietly. On me, on this town, on everyone who knew you. A mark of absence, Clara said, a mark of loss. That's not the same as leaving something positive behind. Daniel considered this, then shook his head. You're wrong. Because your choice, painful as it was, taught me things I needed to learn. It taught me that love can't hold someone who needs to be free. It taught me that people are more complex than the roles we assign them. It taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone go, even when it breaks your heart. Those are hard lessons. The best ones usually are. But Daniel squeezed her hand. And maybe now, 40 years later, you're teaching me something else. What's that? That it's possible to come back, that mistakes don't have to be permanent, that maybe, just maybe, some stories don't end when we think they do. Clara turned to him, her weathered face illuminated by the lamplight from the store window. What if I can't be what you need me to be? What if I try and fail? Then you fail, Daniel said simply. But at least you tried. At least we both tried. Before Clara could respond, footsteps approached in the darkness. Elizabeth emerged from the shadows, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. I saw the lamp burning, she said. Thought I'd check before heading home. Her sharp eyes took in their clasped hands, but she didn't comment. Mrs. Patterson was asking questions again today, about your intentions. Of course she was, Daniel said with a sigh. What did you tell her? That my father's personal life was none of her business, Elizabeth said dryly. She didn't appreciate that answer. Despite the tension of the moment, Clara felt a laugh escape. I imagine she didn't. Elizabeth studied them both for a moment, then surprised them by sitting down on the step beside Clara. Can I ask you something? And will you answer honestly? I'll try, Clara said. Do you love my father? The directness of the question left Clara momentarily speechless. She looked at Daniel, then back at Elizabeth, searching for the right words. I love the man I knew 40 years ago, Clara said slowly, and I'm learning to know the man he is now, whether that becomes love, real, present love, not just memory. I can't say yet, but I want to find out. Elizabeth nodded, seeming to accept this answer. And you, Father? What do you feel? Daniel didn't hesitate. I feel like I've been given a second chance at something I thought was lost forever. Whether that second chance leads to love or just closure, I don't know, but I'm grateful for it either way. All right, Elizabeth said, standing and brushing off her skirt. Then I'll support whatever you decide. Both of you, but she looked at Clara. If this doesn't work out, if you realize you can't stay, promise me you'll tell him directly. Don't just disappear again. He deserves better than that. I promise, Clara said. Elizabeth nodded once, kissed her father's cheek, and disappeared back into the darkness. They heard her footsteps fading down the street, and then silence returned. Your children are very protective, Clara observed again. They love me, Daniel said. Sometimes that looks like protection. I never had that, Clara said quietly. Love that fought for me. Love that demanded I be honest and stay present. My parents loved me, I suppose, but it was distant, conditional, based on who they needed me to be rather than who I was. Is that why you ran? Because you didn't believe love could exist without conditions? The question struck deep, and Clara felt old wounds opening. Maybe. I'd never seen a relationship where both people stayed fully themselves. Every marriage I knew involved someone shrinking to fit, usually the woman. Sarah didn't shrink, Daniel said. She was exactly herself every day of our marriage. How? Clara asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. How did she manage it? Daniel thought about this, searching his memory for the truth Sarah had lived but never explicitly taught. She chose it, he finally said. Every day she chose to be fully present in her own life. She had opinions and expressed them. She had interests beyond being a wife and mother, and she pursued them. She taught me that partnership doesn't mean becoming one person. It means two people choosing to walk the same direction while remaining themselves. That sounds difficult. It was sometimes, Daniel admitted. We had arguments, disagreements, moments when we couldn't understand each other. But we worked through them because we both believed the other person was worth the effort. Clara absorbed this, her mind working through implications and possibilities. I never learned how to do that, how to stay and fight instead of running when things got hard. Then maybe it's time to learn. At 62? Isn't it too late to change fundamental patterns? Daniel squeezed her hand. You spent 40 years learning to survive alone in the wilderness. Surely you can learn to survive with another person. Surviving with people is harder than surviving alone, Clara said. The wilderness is brutal but honest. People are complicated. Yes, we are, Daniel agreed. But complications can be worth it. They fell into comfortable silence again, and Clara found herself marveling at how natural this felt. Sitting beside Daniel, talking about hard things, holding hands in the darkness. Part of her still wanted to bolt, to return to the simplicity of mountains and solitude. But another part, growing stronger each day, wanted to stay right here, learning how to be human again. Daniel? She said quietly. Yes? Thank you for not giving up on me, even after everything. He turned to look at her, his weathered face gentle in the lamplight. Thank you for coming back, for being brave enough to face what you'd done. I'm not brave, Clara protested. I ran away for 40 years. That's the opposite of brave. You're here now, Daniel said. You're facing your past, answering hard questions, letting my children interrogate you. You're trying to learn things that terrify you. That's brave, Clara. Maybe braver than leaving ever was. The words settled over her like a benediction, and Clara felt something shift deep inside her chest. For 40 years, she'd defined herself by the choice she'd made to leave, had carried the weight of it like a brand marking her as a coward. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe coming back, facing consequences, trying to build something new from ruins, maybe that took a different kind of courage. I'm still scared, she admitted. Good, Daniel said. That means it matters. Only things that matter are worth being scared of. The next morning brought Sunday, and with it Daniel's promised visit to the ranch for dinner. Clara had assumed she wouldn't be included, but Elizabeth appeared at the boarding house just after dawn. You're coming, Elizabeth said without preamble when Clara answered the door. I don't think that's wise, Clara said. Thomas needs to see that you're not going away, Elizabeth interrupted. And you need to face all of us together. Consider it trial by fire. That's not encouraging. It's not meant to be encouraging. It's meant to be honest. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. Besides, Mary specifically asked me to bring you. She wants to talk. That sounds ominous. Probably is, Elizabeth agreed cheerfully, but you're coming anyway. Be ready at noon. She left before Clara could protest further, and Clara spent the morning in a state of mounting anxiety. She had nothing appropriate to wear to a family dinner, just the 2 simple dresses she'd purchased with the last of her money and her old mountain clothes. She settled on the better of the 2 dresses, braided her gray-streaked hair with care, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. This felt more terrifying than facing down any predator in the wild. The ranch sat 3 miles outside town, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a valley with the mountains rising behind. As Daniel drove the wagon up the long approach, Clara took in the careful organization of the place. The sturdy barn, the well-tended corrals, the main house with its wide porch and neat garden. Thomas built most of this himself, Daniel said, pride evident in his voice. He's got a good eye for land and livestock. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Through the windows of the main house, she could see movement, people gathering, preparing. The whole family would be there. Thomas and his wife, Margaret, Mary and her husband, George, Elizabeth. 5 grandchildren whose names Clara had heard but couldn't quite remember in her panic. The wagon stopped, and Daniel helped her down with a steady hand. Breathe, he said quietly. They're just people, Clara. Family, yes, but still just people. They're your family, Clara corrected. They're the life you built after I destroyed the first one. That's not nothing. No, it's not nothing, Daniel agreed. But it's also not something you can destroy again. We're all adults now. We can handle complicated truths. Before Clara could respond, the front door opened and Thomas stepped out. His expression was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Pa, he said, embracing Daniel. Then he turned to Clara, and something complicated moved across his face. "Miss Whitmore, welcome to our home." The formality was pointed, but Clara appreciated it. At least he was trying. "Thank you for having me," she said quietly. Inside, the house smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread. Margaret, a solid woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, greeted them warmly, though Clara noticed her protective hover near Thomas. The children were introduced in a blur of names and ages, ranging from 5 to 16. They stared at Clara with undisguised curiosity, and she heard whispers of mountain woman and ghost lady. Mary appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. She studied Clara for a long moment, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and embracing her. "Welcome," Mary said simply. "I'm glad you came." The gesture seemed to break some tension in the room. Margaret relaxed slightly. Thomas's jaw unclenched a fraction. The children went back to their play, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. Dinner was a carefully orchestrated affair. They gathered around a long table that showed the marks of years of family meals. Daniel sat at one end with Clara beside him, a positioning that didn't go unnoticed by anyone. The food was excellent: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread still warm from the oven. Conversation flowed around neutral topics: weather, harvest prospects, town gossip that didn't involve Clara. But halfway through the meal, Thomas set down his fork with deliberate care. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. The table fell silent. Margaret placed a warning hand on his arm, but he gently removed it. "I've been angry," Thomas said, looking directly at Clara. "Angry at you for coming back and disrupting Pa's peace. Angry at him for letting you. Angry at the whole situation." "Thomas," Daniel began, but his son held up a hand. "Let me finish, Pa." Thomas took a breath. "But I've been thinking about what Ma would say if she were here, and I realized she'd tell me that holding on to anger is just another way of letting the past control the present." He turned back to Clara. "I don't understand why you left. I probably never will. And I'm still not sure I trust you. But I can see that Pa wants to figure this out. And I can see that you're trying." He paused. "So I'm willing to give you a chance. One chance. Don't waste it." The pronouncement hung in the air, and Clara felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know that costs you something." "It does," Thomas agreed, "but family is worth the cost." Mary spoke up from across the table. "I want to understand something. You spent 40 years alone in the wilderness. What did you do all that time? How did you fill your days?" The question seemed genuinely curious rather than confrontational, and Clara considered it carefully before answering. "I survived," she said. "That took most of each day, especially in winter. Finding or hunting food, maintaining shelter, keeping warm. But in the quieter moments, I observed, watched how animals moved through the seasons, learned the patterns of weather and growth, tried to understand the rhythms of the natural world." "That sounds lonely," Margaret said softly. "It was," Clara admitted, "but it was also clear, simple. Every problem had a direct solution. Every challenge could be met with skill and determination. There was a purity to it that I found beautiful." "Until it wasn't enough anymore," Mary said. "Until it wasn't enough anymore," Clara agreed. Elizabeth leaned forward, her sharp eyes thoughtful. "What changed? What made you decide to come back after all those years?" Clara looked at Daniel, then back at the faces around the table. Thomas's suspicion, Mary's curiosity, Margaret's caution, Elizabeth's assessment. They were all watching her, waiting for truth. "I realized that surviving isn't the same as living," she said slowly. "I'd become very good at existing from day to day, but I'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something larger than myself. To matter to someone. To have my presence or absence affect the world in meaningful ways." She paused. "In the mountains, if I died, the world would continue unchanged. No one would mourn. No one would notice. And I realized that despite all my talk of freedom, that kind of absolute independence is just another form of prison." The honesty seemed to surprise them. Thomas's expression softened slightly. Mary nodded as if Clara had confirmed something she'd suspected. "So you came back to matter to someone," Mary said. "To my father specifically." "Yes," Clara said simply. "And to apologize, and to see if 40 years had destroyed everything or if there might be something left to build on." "And is there?" Thomas asked. Clara looked at Daniel, who met her gaze with steady warmth. I think so, she said, but we're still figuring that out. The meal continued with slightly less tension after that. The children grew brave enough to ask Clara questions about the mountains, which she answered with stories carefully edited for young ears. She described tracking elk through deep snow, finding caves with ancient paintings, watching eagles hunt from distant ridges. The children listened with wide eyes, and even the adults seemed drawn in despite themselves. After dinner, while Margaret and Mary cleared the table and the men moved to the porch with coffee, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen with Elizabeth and the two older grandchildren, a girl of 16 named Sarah, after her grandmother, and a boy of 14 named James. Young Sarah studied Clara with disconcerting directness. Did you really live all alone for 40 years? I did, Clara confirmed. Weren't you scared? Sometimes. But fear becomes familiar after a while. You learn to work with it instead of letting it paralyze you. I think you're brave, Sarah said simply. Everyone says you ran away, but I think it takes courage to choose a hard life when an easy one is available. The observation, coming from a 16-year-old girl, struck Clara with unexpected force. Thank you, she said quietly, though I'm not sure everyone would agree with you. Not everyone has to agree, Sarah said with the certainty of youth. You made a choice that was right for you, even if it hurt other people. That's complicated, but it's not wrong. Elizabeth, who'd been quietly washing dishes, spoke up. Sarah wants to go east for university, against her father's wishes. Clara understood the subtext immediately. She looked at the young woman who carried her grandmother's name and saw the same restless energy that had defined her own youth. What does your father say? Clara asked. That I should stay here, marry well, have children, Sarah said with barely concealed frustration. That education is wasted on women because we'll just end up in the kitchen anyway. And what do you say? That I want more than that. That there's a whole world beyond this valley, and I want to see it, learn about it, be part of it. Sarah's eyes flashed with passion. But everyone acts like wanting more is selfish or unnatural. Clara set down the dish she'd been drying and gave Sarah her full attention. It's not selfish to want to be fully yourself. But it is complicated. Because choosing yourself sometimes means hurting people you love, and you have to be prepared to live with that consequence. Is that why you left grandfather? Yes, Clara said honestly. I chose myself over him. I chose freedom over love, and I've spent 40 years living with that choice, the good parts and the terrible parts. Do you regret it? Sarah asked. Clara considered the question carefully. Around her, the kitchen had gone quiet. Elizabeth and young James both listening, waiting for her answer. I regret the pain I caused, Clara said finally. I regret not being brave enough to find a middle path, some way to honor both my needs and his. But do I regret the life I lived, the things I learned and experienced, the person I became? She paused. No, I don't regret those things. They made me who I am. Even though you came back? James asked. Even though you're here now, instead of in the mountains? Coming back doesn't negate the years I spent away, Clara said. It just means I've learned something new, that maybe the choice doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe there's a way to be free and connected at the same time. Have you found that way? Sarah asked. I'm trying to, Clara admitted. Your grandfather and I are both trying. We don't know if it will work, but we're willing to try. Sarah studied her with those disconcerting young eyes. I think grandmother would have liked you, she said finally. Father says she was always helping people find their own path, even when it wasn't the easy one. The words brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. She blinked them back and nodded. I wish I could have known her. Maybe you still can, Elizabeth said quietly. Through the people she shaped, through the life she built, through the lessons she taught us. Before Clara could respond, Daniel appeared in the doorway. The light's fading, he said. We should head back to town soon. The goodbye felt easier than the arrival had been. Thomas shook her hand with something approaching warmth. Margaret embraced her carefully. Mary kissed her cheek and whispered, Give him time. He's trying. The children waved enthusiastically, already planning questions for next time. On the wagon ride back to town, as the sun set behind them and the mountains rose dark against the sky ahead, Daniel reached over and took Clara's hand. That went better than expected, he said. Your granddaughter thinks I'm brave, Clara said wonderingly, and she wants to leave just like I did. I know. Daniel's voice was troubled. Thomas is fighting it, but Sarah's as stubborn as they come. What do you think? I think people have to make their own choices, Daniel said. Even when those choices hurt. Even when we wish they'd choose differently. He squeezed her hand. You taught me that, Clara, 40 years ago and again now. Sometimes the only choice is to let go and trust that love can survive distance. Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks, the second time that day she'd cried, which was more than she'd cried in the previous decade. But these tears felt different, cleansing somehow, like something frozen inside her was finally beginning to thaw. I'm terrified, she whispered. Of what? That I'll get used to this. That I'll let myself belong here, let myself need you and your family and this life. And then something will happen, and I'll lose it all. Daniel was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses with steady hands. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. That's the risk of loving, Clara, of belonging. You might lose it, something might happen. But the alternative, protecting yourself by staying isolated, that's just a slower kind of dying. I know, Clara said. I spent 40 years dying that slow death. I don't want to do it anymore. Then don't, Daniel said simply. Take the risk. Let yourself belong. Let yourself love. And whatever happens, at least you'll have tried. They rode through the gathering darkness, hands clasped, while around them the prairie settled into sleep, and the mountains stood silent witness to two people learning, finally, how to choose both freedom and connection, both independence and love. The turning point came 3 weeks after the dinner at the ranch, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that felt like any other until it wasn't. Clara was in the storeroom organizing supplies when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. She emerged to find Daniel facing a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. I'm telling you, I saw her, the man was saying, his voice carrying an edge of certainty. Up in the high country, maybe 15 years back. A woman living alone in a cave shelter near Harper's Peak. Had to be the same person. Daniel's face had gone very still. And you're sure it was a woman? Positive. I was tracking elk and came across her camp. She had a rifle trained on me before I even knew she was there. The man shook his head admiringly. Told me to leave her territory and never come back. I respected that. Woman who can survive alone up there deserves her privacy. Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. That was me. The man's eyes widened. You're the one? The ghost of Harper's Peak? I'm no ghost, Clara said. Just someone who wanted to be left alone. The man studied her with new interest. Then his expression shifted to something like awe. Ma'am, I've been trapping these mountains for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone, man or woman, set up as well as you were. That shelter, the way you'd positioned everything for defense and efficiency. That was professional-grade survival work. I learned as I went, Clara said simply. Well, you learned better than most. The man tipped his hat. Name's John Fletcher. I run a guide service out of the next territory. If you're ever looking for work, I could use someone with your skills. Plenty of greenhorns from back east want to see the wilderness, but don't know the first thing about surviving it. Clara felt something stir in her chest, a mix of pride and longing and complicated regret. Thank you, but I'm not sure I'm suited for that work anymore. Fletcher shrugged. Offer stands if you change your mind. A woman who can survive Harper's Peak alone for years, that's someone worth hiring. He purchased his supplies and left, the bell chiming his departure. The silence that followed felt heavy. Daniel stood behind the counter, his weathered hands resting on the wood, his expression unreadable. You never told me about the rifle, he said quietly. There were a lot of things I didn't tell you, Clara said. A lot of details that seemed too small or too painful or just too much. Tell me now. Daniel moved around the counter to stand before her. I need to understand the whole truth, Clara, not just the parts you think I can handle. So she told him. About the first winter when she'd nearly starved, eating pine bark and boiling leather scraps to survive. About the grizzly that had destroyed her camp and how she'd rebuilt everything from memory and sheer stubbornness. About the years of absolute solitude when weeks would pass without her speaking a single word aloud, her voice growing rough from disuse. About the time she'd been so lonely, she'd sit by her fire and have conversations with herself just to hear human speech. She told him about the man who'd tried to assault her in her 3rd year, and how she'd fought him off with a skinning knife and then moved her camp 20 miles north, about the fever that had nearly killed her at age 50, when she'd lain delirious in her shelter for days with no one to help. About the winter night when she'd been so cold and exhausted that she'd simply laid down in the snow and waited to die, only to wake at dawn and force herself to keep going. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face growing more strained with each revelation. When she finally fell silent, her voice hoarse from the telling, he stood very still. "You could have died 100 different ways," he said roughly. "Any one of those moments could have killed you." "Yes," Clara agreed, "but they didn't." "Because you were stubborn and skilled and impossibly brave." Daniel's voice cracked. "And because you were alone with no one to help you when you needed it most." "That was my choice." "It was a terrible choice," Daniel said, and Clara heard real anger in his voice for the first time since she'd returned. "A choice born from fear and lack of imagination. You thought the only options were suffocation or complete isolation. You never considered that there might be something in between." "I didn't know how to look for middle ground," Clara said, her own anger rising. "I was 22 years old and terrified. I did the best I could with what I knew." "And you suffered for it. Horribly, for 40 years. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. "Do you understand what it does to me to hear these stories? To know that while I was here, safe and surrounded by family, you were fighting to survive alone?" "What would you have had me do?" Clara demanded. "Come back and pretend I could be happy in a life that felt like dying? Marry you and spend decades resenting you for it?" "I would have had you talk to me." Daniel's voice rose. "I would have had you trust me enough to tell me the truth instead of just disappearing. Maybe we could have found a solution. Maybe we could have built something different together. Or maybe I would have stayed and slowly destroyed both of us," Clara shot back. "Maybe my restlessness would have poisoned everything until you hated me and I hated myself. We'll never know, will we? Because you didn't give us the chance." The words hung between them, raw and painful. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. They were both breathing hard, 40 years of unspoken hurt finally erupting into the open. "You're right," Clara said finally, her voice dropping. "I didn't give us a chance. I was too scared and too young and too convinced that I knew the only way forward. I robbed us both of choices, and I'm sorrier for that than I can ever express." Daniel's anger seemed to drain away, leaving only exhaustion. "I don't want apologies anymore, Clara. I want honesty, complete honesty. If we're going to try to build something here, if there's any chance of this working, I need to know all of you, not just the parts you think are acceptable." "Even the ugly parts?" Clara asked. "Even the parts that make me look selfish and cruel?" "Especially those parts." Daniel stepped closer. "Because I'm not interested in loving some idealized version of you. I want to love the real person, flaws and all. But I can't do that if you keep hiding." The word love hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her breath catch. It was the first time either of them had used that word in the present tense, and its weight was enormous. "I don't know if I'm capable of being that vulnerable," she whispered. "Then learn," Daniel said. "We'll learn together." He reached for her, and Clara let herself be pulled into his arms. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet store, while afternoon light slanted through the windows and dust motes danced in golden beams. "I'm still angry," Daniel said against her hair. "At you for leaving. At myself for not fighting harder to understand you. At the whole situation for being so impossible." "That's fair," Clara said. "But I also love you." Daniel pulled back enough to look at her face. "Not the girl you were. Not some memory I've been carrying. But the woman standing here now, scarred and stubborn and impossibly brave. I love her, and I want to build a life with her if she'll let me." Clara felt the tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "I don't know how to do this, Daniel. I don't know how to be in a relationship without losing myself." "So we figure it out," Daniel said, "day by day. We make mistakes and fix them. We have arguments and work through them. We learn how to be ourselves and together at the same time." "What if I panic? What if I wake up one day and the walls start closing in and all I can think about is running?" "Then you tell me," Daniel said firmly. "You don't disappear. You don't run without a word. You talk to me and we figure it out together. Maybe that means we take a break. Maybe it means you go camping in the mountains for a few days to clear your head. Maybe it just means we sit down and talk through what's scaring you. But you don't run without giving me a chance to help. Clara searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, but found only steady determination. You're asking me to trust you with my absolute worst impulses. Yes, Daniel said, and I'm trusting you with mine. That's what partnership means. I could still hurt you. You probably will, Daniel agreed, and I'll probably hurt you too. But we'll survive it if we're honest with each other. Clara took a shaky breath, feeling the enormity of what he was offering. A second chance, a new beginning, a relationship built on truth instead of idealized romance. All right, she said quietly. I'll try. I'll really try this time. Daniel smiled, and Clara saw hope and love and determination in his weathered face. That's all I'm asking. They were still standing there, foreheads touching, when Elizabeth walked in carrying the day's mail. She took one look at them and smiled. Finally, Elizabeth said, I was wondering when you two would stop dancing around each other. Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. We weren't dancing. You were absolutely dancing, Elizabeth said, very politely, very carefully, like two people afraid to step on each other's toes. She set down the mail with a decisive thump. So what happens now? Daniel and Clara looked at each other, and Clara saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They declared their feelings, committed to trying, but the practical next steps remained unclear. I suppose I should find more permanent lodging, Clara said slowly. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is expensive, and I'm nearly out of money. You could stay above the store, Daniel said. There's a spare room. Elizabeth uses it sometimes when she works late, but it's mostly empty. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Father, are you inviting Clara to move in with you? I'm offering her a practical solution to a housing problem, Daniel said with careful dignity. Uh-huh. Elizabeth's smile was knowing. And the fact that this would allow you to spend more time together is just a happy coincidence? Exactly, Daniel said, refusing to be embarrassed. Clara felt a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. Won't that cause talk? Everything causes talk in this town, Elizabeth said. Might as well give them something worth talking about. She grew more serious. But truly, Clara, if you're staying, if you're really trying to build a life here, you'll need proper work. Helping at the store is fine temporarily, but you need income of your own. What would you suggest? Clara asked. I have very few marketable skills beyond survival. That's not true, Elizabeth said. You're organized and efficient. You learn quickly. You're good with inventory and can handle difficult customers without flinching. Those are valuable skills. Elizabeth's right, Daniel said. You've made the storeroom more efficient in 3 weeks than I managed in 3 years. You have a mind for systems and order. Clara absorbed this, considering possibilities she'd never imagined. I suppose I could look for work as a clerk or housekeeper. Or, Elizabeth said slowly, you could become a partner in the store. Father's been talking about expanding, maybe opening a second location or adding new product lines. He could use someone with fresh perspective and strong organizational skills. Daniel looked surprised. I hadn't thought of that, but Elizabeth's right. We've been growing steadily, and I'm not getting any younger. Having a partner could allow us to expand in ways I've been putting off. You'd really want me as a partner? Clara asked, stunned. After everything? Who better? Daniel said. You know the business now. You work hard. You're honest, and... He smiled. I trust you. Despite everything, I trust you. The words hit Clara harder than any declaration of love could have. Trust. After what she'd done, after 40 years of absence and betrayal, he trusted her. I don't deserve that, she whispered. Probably not, Daniel agreed, but I'm giving it anyway. Consider it an investment in our future. Elizabeth clapped her hands together. Good. That's settled then. We'll draw up proper partnership papers, work out the financial details, and get Clara registered as co-owner. I'll handle the legal side. Wait, Clara said, overwhelmed. This is moving very fast. Is it? Elizabeth challenged. You've been back for almost a month. Father's made his feelings clear. You've met the family and survived. You've proven you can do the work. What exactly are we waiting for? Clara looked at Daniel, searching for the right words. I'm still scared, she admitted. Of commitment, of permanence, of making promises I might not be able to keep. Then don't make promises, Daniel said. Make choices. Day by day, choice by choice. Choose to stay today. Choose to work with me today. Choose to try today. And tomorrow, you can choose again. The simplicity of it was almost beautiful. No grand declarations, no binding vows that might feel like cages. Just daily choices, renewable and honest. All right, Clara said. I choose to try. Today, I choose to stay. Daniel's smile transformed his entire face. That's enough for me. The weeks that followed brought their own challenges and revelations. The legal partnership was formalized, giving Clara official standing and a share of the profits. She moved into the spare room above the store, gradually adding personal touches that made it feel like home. She learned the deeper intricacies of running a business, dealing with suppliers, managing accounts, handling the endless small crises that arose. But more importantly, she learned how to be in relationship with Daniel. They had their first real argument over inventory management, voices rising until Elizabeth threatened to knock their heads together. They worked through it awkwardly, neither quite sure how to compromise, but eventually finding middle ground. Clara had her first panic attack on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after moving in. She woke up feeling the walls closing in, her chest tight with irrational fear. Instead of running, she found Daniel in the kitchen and told him she needed space. He nodded, asked if she wanted company or solitude, and when she said solitude, he simply kissed her forehead and told her to take whatever time she needed. She walked to the edge of town and sat looking at the mountains for 3 hours, breathing through the fear until it passed. When she returned, Daniel was waiting with coffee and no questions. The fact that he'd let her go and trusted she'd come back meant more than any words could have. They attended Sunday dinner at the ranch every week, and gradually Clara's presence became less remarkable. Thomas warmed slowly, having actual conversations about ranching and livestock. Mary drew her into planning the church social, treating her as an equal rather than an outsider. The grandchildren taught her card games and begged for mountain stories. Young Sarah sought Clara out one Sunday afternoon, pulling her aside while the others were occupied. I told Father I'm going east for university, Sarah said, her young face set with determination. He's furious, but I'm not changing my mind. Clara felt a complicated mix of pride and concern. How did he react? Like I'd announced I was joining a traveling circus, Sarah said with dark humor. He said I was throwing away my future, being selfish, breaking the family apart. And what did you say? That my future is mine to define. That choosing myself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That leaving doesn't mean I don't love them. Sarah looked at Clara. I used your words, the things you told me about making hard choices. Clara felt the weight of influence and responsibility. Sarah, I need you to understand something. The choice I made had consequences I didn't anticipate. I hurt people I loved. I spent 40 years alone because I didn't know how to find middle ground. But you came back, Sarah said. You found a way to have both, yourself and connection. That's what I want. To go, to learn, to become myself, and then come back and share that with my family. That's wiser than I was at your age, Clara admitted. I thought it had to be all or nothing. But will you talk to Father? Sarah asked. Help him understand that I'm not abandoning the family, that this is important. Clara wanted to refuse to stay out of family dynamics that didn't involve her, but looking at Sarah's determined young face, she saw herself at 22, desperate for understanding, terrified of being trapped, willing to do anything to breathe free. I'll try, Clara said. But Sarah, you need to stay in communication with them. Write letters. Visit when you can. Don't do what I did and disappear completely. That's what turns a brave choice into a betrayal. I won't, Sarah promised. I've learned from your mistakes. That evening, after dinner, Clara found herself alone with Thomas on the porch while the others cleaned up inside. She'd been dreading this conversation, but Sarah's request made it necessary. Your daughter came to me for advice, Clara said without preamble. Thomas's jaw tightened. I know. She told me. I didn't encourage her to leave. Didn't you? Thomas turned to face her. You're the example she's following. The woman who chose freedom over family. Of course she thinks that's the right path. It was the right path for me, Clara said carefully, but I also paid a terrible price for it. And I've spent the last month trying to help Sarah understand that there are better ways to choose yourself, ways that don't require burning all your bridges. Thomas absorbed this, some of his anger deflating. She's so young. She doesn't understand what she's giving up. She's the same age I was when I left, Clara said. And yes, she's young and idealistic and probably underestimating the challenges ahead. But Thomas, she paused, choosing her words carefully. If you force her to stay, you'll lose her anyway. She'll resent you. The life you want for her will feel like a prison. And one day she'll leave anyway, but without your blessing and support. So I should just let her go? Thomas's voice was rough. Watch my daughter walk away? No. You should let her know you love her enough to support her choices, even when they scare you. You should stay connected. Make it clear that leaving for university doesn't mean leaving the family. It just means growing in a different direction. Clara's voice softened. Your father did that for me, in a way. He let me go, even though it destroyed him. And 40 years later, when I finally came back, his door was still open. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening prairie. You really think she'll come back? I think if you make it possible for her to leave with love instead of anger, she'll always feel connected to home. And yes, she'll come back, maybe not to stay, but to visit, to share her life, to be part of the family. Clara paused. That's more than I gave my parents, more than I gave your father. Let Sarah do better than I did. Thomas turned to look at her, and Clara saw some of his protective anger give way to grudging understanding. I still don't like it. You don't have to like it, Clara said. You just have to love her through it. The conversation marked a shift in Thomas's attitude toward Clara. He was never warm exactly, but his hostility faded into something more like cautious respect. At the next Sunday dinner, he actually asked her opinion on a business decision, and when she gave it, he listened. Autumn arrived with sharp mornings and golden afternoons. The store thrived under the expanded partnership, with Clara's organizational skills complementing Daniel's customer relationships. They settled into rhythms that felt both new and strangely familiar. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, evenings reviewing accounts while rain pattered against windows, small touches and smiles that carried 40 years of history. But the real test came on a cold November night when Clara woke from a nightmare, gasping and disoriented. In her dream, she'd been back in the mountains, trapped in her shelter during an avalanche, slowly suffocating under tons of snow with no one to help. She sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding, and felt the familiar urge to run, to grab what little she owned and disappear back into the wilderness where she understood the rules, where fear meant real danger instead of this complicated tangle of emotion and vulnerability. She was halfway to packing her bag when Daniel appeared in her doorway. Going somewhere? He asked quietly. Clara froze, caught. I can't breathe. I need to go. Go where? The mountains. Anywhere. I don't know. Her hands shook. I'm sorry, Daniel. I tried, but I can't do this. Daniel crossed the room and gently took the bag from her hand, setting it aside. You had a nightmare. It's not just the nightmare, Clara said desperately. It's everything. The expectations, the permanence, the feeling that I'm being slowly absorbed into a life I didn't choose. Did I ask you to be absorbed? Daniel asked. Have I tried to change who you are? No, but Clara struggled to articulate the fear. But staying means choosing you over myself, choosing this life over freedom. And I'm terrified that one day I'll wake up and realize I've disappeared again, just in a different way. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Clara braced herself for anger or hurt. Instead, he surprised her. Get dressed, he said. We're going for a ride. What? Daniel, it's the middle of the night. I know what time it is. Get dressed. Confused but obedient, Clara pulled on warm clothes. Daniel did the same, then led her down to the stable behind the store. He saddled 2 horses with efficient movements, and they rode out of town under a sky brilliant with stars. They rode for an hour in silence, and Clara slowly realized where they were heading. The oak tree with the split trunk. The ridge where they'd met when they were courting 40 years ago. Daniel dismounted and helped her down, then spread a blanket on the ground beneath the ancient tree. They sat together, looking out over the valley where the town slept, a scattering of lights against vast darkness. This is where I came, Daniel said. That second anniversary when I realized I was still carrying you with me. This is where I let myself be angry and hurt and lost. Clara waited, sensing he had more to say. I've been thinking about what you said, Daniel continued, about staying meaning choosing me over yourself. And I realized you're looking at it wrong. Choosing to stay isn't choosing me instead of yourself. It's choosing both. It's choosing to be yourself and in relationship at the same time. I don't know how to do that, Clara whispered. Because you've only ever practiced extremes, Daniel said. Complete isolation or complete surrender. But Clara, there's so much space in between, so many ways to be connected without losing yourself. He turned to face her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. You think staying here means giving up the mountains, Daniel said. But who says you can't have both? Go camping when you need to. Spend a week or two in the high country clearing your head. Take hunting trips, or just go sit in the wilderness and remember who you are. I'm not asking you to give that up. Clara stared at him. You'd really let me leave for weeks at a time? It's not about letting you, Daniel said. You're not mine to control. But yes, I'd support it. I'd worry, probably. I'd miss you. But I'd understand that you need that space to stay whole. What kind of relationship works like that? Clara asked, bewildered. Ours, apparently, Daniel said with a slight smile. We're not exactly conventional people, Clara. Why should we have a conventional relationship? The idea was so simple and so revolutionary that Clara felt her panic begin to ease. You really mean that? I could go into the mountains and you wouldn't see it as abandonment? As long as you tell me when you're going and approximately when you'll be back, go whenever you need to, Daniel said. Take space. Breathe. Be yourself in all the ways that make you who you are, and then come back and be yourself with me. As Clara felt tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve you. Probably not, Daniel agreed, but you're stuck with me anyway. She laughed through her tears and let him pull her close. They sat together under the ancient oak while the stars wheeled overhead and the November wind whispered through bare branches. I'm still scared, Clara admitted. Good, Daniel said. Fear means you're trying something that matters. What if I fail? What if I leave one day and realize I can't come back? Then I'll miss you, Daniel said simply. And I'll be sad. But I won't regret trying. I won't regret loving you. Clara pulled back to look at his face, weathered and dear in the starlight. I love you too, she said. I think I've loved you continuously for 40 years, even when I was running from it. I know, Daniel said. I could see it in your eyes that first day when you walked into the store. You were terrified and brave and still in love all at once. What happens now? Clara asked. Now we go home, Daniel said. We get some sleep. Tomorrow you can decide again if you want to stay. And the day after that. And the day after that. As many days as you choose to keep choosing this. They rode back to town as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 40 years. Not certainty, she would probably never have that, but something like peace. The understanding that she could be both free and connected, both herself and in love, both wild and home. 2 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, Daniel and Clara stood before the justice of the peace in a simple ceremony witnessed by Daniel's children and a handful of close friends. Clara wore a dress that Elizabeth had helped her choose, simple and practical, but beautiful in its clean lines. Daniel wore his best suit, the one he'd been married in before, and if he shed a quiet tear for Sarah's memory, Clara understood and didn't mind. The ceremony was brief and honest. They didn't promise forever. That seemed like tempting fate. Instead, they promised to choose each other daily, to communicate honestly, to make space for both connection and independence. They promised to keep trying, even when it was hard, and to let each other go when necessary while trusting in the coming back. When the justice pronounced them married, Clara felt no cage descending. Instead, she felt like she'd finally found solid ground after decades of wandering. Not a ground that trapped her, but one that gave her a place to stand while still being free to roam. The reception was held at the ranch, with Thomas and Margaret hosting despite Thomas's initial reservations. The food was plentiful, the music simple, and the speeches heartfelt. Mary spoke about second chances and the courage it takes to try again. Elizabeth toasted to unconventional love and finding your own path. Even Thomas stood and said, somewhat gruffly, that anyone who could survive 40 years alone in the mountains was probably stubborn enough to handle being married to his father. Young Sarah pulled Clara aside as the evening was winding down. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Father gave his blessing for university. He said you helped him understand." "I'm glad," Clara said. "Write to him often, Sarah. Don't make my mistakes." "I won't," Sarah promised. "But I'm also grateful for your mistakes. They taught me that it's possible to leave and come back, that choosing yourself doesn't have to mean losing everyone else." As winter deepened, Clara and Daniel settled into married life with surprising ease. They kept separate bedrooms, which raised some eyebrows but worked for them. Clara still woke sometimes with the need to be alone, to sit in darkness and remember who she was outside of relationship. Daniel understood and gave her space. True to his word, when spring came and Clara felt the familiar pull of the mountains, Daniel helped her pack supplies for a 2-week trip into the high country. He kissed her goodbye without clinging, told her to be safe, and asked her to come back when she was ready. Clara spent those 2 weeks in the wilderness she knew so well, trekking through familiar valleys and sleeping under stars that had witnessed her solitary years. But this time, the solitude felt different, not like escape, but like breathing room, not like running away, but like visiting a part of herself she needed to remember. And on the 14th day, she packed her camp and headed home, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because Daniel was waiting, and Elizabeth had probably reorganized the storeroom in some way that would drive Clara crazy, and Thomas's wife was pregnant again, and young Sarah had written from university with questions only Clara could answer. She had a life now, a messy, complicated, beautiful life that included both wilderness and community, both freedom and belonging. When she rode into town as the sun was setting, Daniel was on the porch of the store, as if he'd known exactly when she'd return. He smiled as she approached, and Clara felt her heart expand with something too large for words. "Welcome home," he said simply. And Clara realized that was exactly what it was. Not a cage, not a trap, just home. A place she could leave and return to, a place that held her without confining her, a person who loved her without trying to change her. She dismounted and walked into his arms, and the circle that had been broken 40 years ago finally, imperfectly, beautifully closed. They stood together on the porch while the town settled into evening around them, two people who had learned the hard way that love isn't about possession or surrender. It's about choice. Daily, renewable, honest choice. Clara chose to stay. Not forever, that was too big and frightening a concept. But today, and tomorrow, when it came, she would choose again. For now, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.